Okay, fantastic. I believe we are live and running. Welcome to our first content panel for Psychedelic Capital. So we're going to be discussing clinical trials and real-world evidence today. Henri from the Conscious Fund will be moderating, should his Malteser Wi-Fi allow. And we are joined by Malcolm Barratt-Johnson, Matthew Johnson, and Andrew Pendrill. We almost have 3 Johnsons in the room. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Very much appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually hope we have 5 Johnsons, otherwise somebody's got a severe medical problem. So to begin with, I think that probably the easiest thing is if you could all just give a brief introduction and also maybe talk about the companies that you work for, and then I'm going to kick things off and start firing questions. So, Andrew, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you, Henri. Andrew Pendrill. I'm the CEO of Delica Inc. I guess our profile is My Delica. We're a spin out from Imperial College London. The founder is Robin Carhart-Harris. Effectively, we're trying to capture data out there, perspective in the wild data of psychedelic use, and try and leverage that data for greater good.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Hi, so I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. I'm one of the leaders of our nominal Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Hopkins. I've been doing clinical research with psychedelics for 17 years now, since 2004. Have published on any number of things in both healthy normals and in clinical trials. So mystical experience, change in personality, openness, treatment of cancer patients, depression, anxiety within cancer patients, treatment of people with major depressive disorder. I developed the notion of treating people for nicotine dependence, so helping with smoking cessation with psilocybin. All of this, by the way, with psilocybin, although I've also worked with some other psychedelic compounds. And also am embarking currently on work to treat opioid use disorder and PTSD with psilocybin, and also treating chronic pain with LSD. Some other things, but that's a good, that's enough. It's a good idea. But.
Malcolm, over to you.
Henry, thank you. Matthew, that's fascinating. I'm Malcolm Barratt-Johnson. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Albert Labs. I'm an anaesthetist by training, a medical doctor, still am. Used to work for the MHRA in London. I used to run the clinical trials division for the UK government at one point on the medical side. Albert Labs is based in Canada. It's a Canadian-based company, but our research is European-focused. At the moment, we've got a number of research centres coming online in London and Manchester and Birmingham, big centres in the UK. And we're really focusing on anxiety and oncology patients. And there's a very unmet need in the UK and actually indeed worldwide. It addresses 2 UK government focuses, which is effectively the anxiety and neurological aspects, which are absolutely fascinating and important, and also the aspect of looking at new entities in this space in oncology. So we're we've had an amazing run in the last year, and we've got an amazing team on board with a very, very good advisory board. So I'm very lucky to work with you, and thank you very much indeed for asking us to take part tonight.
Pleasure. So let's dive into this. I guess in order to frame the question, I would kind of ask everyone to look at this very much from an investor, almost a layman's perspective. Andrew, if we could start with you, could you talk a little bit about the typical prognosis for a clinical trial? So how long does it take? What is the kind of average cost? What does a typical clinical trial look like that uses a traditional pathway?
Well, perhaps the obvious one there is Robin's recent study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which intentionally was due to be 60 patients, but one dropped out. So you end up with 59 patients in the study. the cost was broadly about $1 million to give you a sense of it. And the time period, it depends when you define the start of a clinical trial, of course. If we're actually talking about from patient recruitment to patient completion, and then when does a trial truly end? Because then there's always follow-up periods. But I think you can easily talk about sort of 6 to 12 months being a very normal structure in terms of time period. And they tend not to be that complicated, but highly costly.
And had that trial gone all the way, let's say that you had a drug under development and you've gone all the way through to phase 3 and the drug was on the market, what kind of time frame are we talking about for that kind of development?
Okay. Sorry, that's typically that's 8 to 10 years as a rough idea. Patent period would be 20 years. So yeah, that gives you a sense of it. There's a lot of speculation. I mean, if you go to Tufts Institute, they'll throw out some numbers as to what they estimate the cost of from zero to hero, as it were, for a clinical development, and you'd roughly be throwing about $1 billion per clinical entity, as a rough idea.
So not cheap and slow, I guess, would be the two very basic conclusions from that. Now, Malcolm, you're working with a very different protocol, famously actually just used for the development of a lot of COVID vaccine work. What is the difference, in essence, between real-world evidence and a traditional clinical trial?
Thanks, Henry. Well, effectively, a clinical trial is, we know from randomized control trials, you have a number of lines of inquiry, effectively. You have patients in maybe one arm or two arms or three arms or four, where you're meeting you're looking at your product or the experimental product against maybe standard of care or against other standards of care together with another product. So you're comparing one against other, and you're basically doing statistics on them to see whether one is actually more efficacious than another or even more safe than another. And you're collecting that data over a very short time, actually, considering it could be quite long, as Andrew said, but it's for normally quite a short period of time, generally speaking. But what have you also got? You've actually got a very controlled number of patients within it. You might have 60, like Andrew said with the study from the other day, or you may have 1,000, but it's still quite a low number. And when you're dealing with patients who are very varied in the way they metabolize substances, or in terms of their genomic structure as well, it doesn't really capture the whole set of data. And so what real-world evidence is and real-world data capture is basically you almost take all comers within the study. So you're basically putting a substance into a population which is preordained, and you're looking at it in real time, and you're collecting the data as you're treating patients in a setting which would be normally the setting in which they're being treated. That's good because it means you've got a much greater number of patients. Quite often you don't have to follow the patients in terms of trying to force them in. Secondly, you've got a much wider genomic structure, so you can see a very wide range of patients. And thirdly, you've got an ability to actually capture safety data, which is difficult actually on such a wide range of patients in a randomized controlled trial. You do capture it, but normally you have to wait to the phase 4 or when it actually comes after a license. And so it's a very good structure to go into real-world evidence.
So it's effectively more realistic. It is a shorter path between the development of the drug and a patient getting it. And I would imagine a much cheaper exercise compared to the sort of $1 billion, hundreds of millions in terms of a traditional clinical trial.
It is. It's extremely expensive to produce medicines nowadays. And Andrew, you're absolutely right. It costs billions to do so. And it's very, very difficult to actually do. And you've got to have an incredibly clever team and great number of people working on it. Real-world evidence, to some extent, avoids most of that. And it's a big advantage over RCTs.
Thank you. Matthew, just from a very broad perspective, does it frustrate the scientific community that developing these substances is so difficult, and that if you have a patient population with an urgent need, there isn't, except for protocols like real-world evidence, there is this very lengthy delay before you're able to actually benefit that patient population, even if you've stumbled across a wonder drug or a highly effective intervention. Does that frustrate sort of scientists as much as it frustrates venture capitalists? I think you may be muted, Matthew. In fact, I'm sure you're muted.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So two directions with that. One, I think, compared to a whole lot of psychedelic, fans out there, we absolutely need, we need these regulatory bodies to vet these medications as well as all other medications for safety and efficacy. And so we need to move through, the registration trials. I mean, most of the research I conduct is earlier phase, not necessarily with an eye towards approval, although some of the things I've worked on are now getting to that phase, and other entities, frankly, have moved into those upper phase trials based on work that my colleagues and I have done. So, deep appreciation for the FDA, the EMA, and equivalent bodies and what they do, and the necessities of clinical trials. On the other hand, particularly for certain disorders, I think of the work with cancer. So we did the largest trial at Hopkins with cancer patients, treating them with psilocybin. Cancer patients with substantial depression and anxiety didn't necessarily have to be terminal, but a good number were terminal. And often that's a hard assessment to make. And that's a kind of a moving target in terms of the state of, cancer treatment. But, gosh, I'm, often contacted by people that say they run across the study that we've published now, a few years ago. And it took us a long time to run that study. My husband's dying of pancreatic cancer. Who's doing this work now? Well, no one's really picked up. We couldn't get any funding to continue that work. No one's really, there's some, entities that have shown some interest, but nothing is happening as far as I know. Keep checking clinicaltrials.gov. Maybe something's happening in a few years. And it's like, my husband has a few months to live, and it's just heartbreaking. And so I'm a big fan, for example, of what, Canada has allowed the compassionate use, and I'm less familiar with their regulations. The U.S. has this possibility, but my impression is that it's a more difficult landscape. So, Canada has already allowed cancer patients to be administered psilocybin, I believe in the form of psilocybin mushrooms, based on the early work, with the idea like, hey, like these people given the record, we know a lot, like physiologically psilocybin is very safe. There are risks, and those are largely behavioral, psychiatric, and you can address those through screening and monitoring and preparation. But with those in place, it does seem absolutely frustrating and horrific that people with a disorder like that can't be treated, more immediately, given what we know at the state of the science.
Yes, it's a terrible balancing act between the need for safety and the patient's need for the most rapid possible access to treatment. It's very difficult kind of to mitigate both. And Andrew, just on the subject of cost, do you think that medicines in some ways have become too expensive to develop? And do you think that is inhibiting the development of beneficial therapies generally?
I think you need a robust process. I think you need rigor in that process. I think there's things that FDA and approving authorities can do to seek additional data to ensure efficacy and safety, because that's ultimately the primary concern. And I think that's where real world evidence can come in and maybe help those approving authorities understand what they're dealing with. So yeah, I think there's options out there, and it's just getting that data and presenting it to those regulatory authorities and getting them to be more and more comfortable with it.
Thank you. Sorry, Malcolm, you were about to say something.
I was just saying, no, I agree, Andrew. No, I think they have become too expensive, and I think we're in a very difficult position globally, psychedelics and all other medicines actually, because we've reached a point now where science is actually advancing so quickly generally that we can't actually treat all the patients with the medicines we got available to us. There's only a limited number of patients within reason with which you can treat, and there's only a limited amount of money. We're very lucky because at this point in time, we've got so much science available to us, and it is getting too expensive. We have to find other ways of treating patients. We have to find other ways of doing research. If we don't, we're going to lose out enormously. So I completely agree, Andrew. I think it is too expensive. And I think this way of looking at real world evidence is very valuable. Looking at the regulatory structure is now changing. It's changing for one good reason. It's been changing for a long time, actually, but the viruses we've had and the awful pandemic we've got at the moment, we've seen this with the vaccines. The vaccines have been actually, it's the biggest trial we've ever had of real world evidence. That's exactly what we did. We actually tested it out on real populations in real time against a real disease. And we've shown it works. So AstraZeneca did that, Pfizer did that, Novavax have done it. And it's an incredibly important lesson for the regulators. And the regulators have suddenly woken up and think, wow, we can do it differently, and we can look at efficacy, safety in real time, and look at safety.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask this both of Matthew and Andrew. This is a kind of picking up something that Matthew said a moment ago, which is that you did this very valuable early work and nobody picked it up and ran with it. Could you elaborate on the reasons why that might happen in academia, and that something promising that clearly has a commercial output at the end of it is just not picked up upon? Why does that happen?
Well, in the case of our work with cancer, which actually, a lot of people miss this, but that is the most advanced finding in the area, for psilocybin, with 3 published randomized clinical trials of various sizes, but 3 double-blind studies suggesting, safety and efficacy and large reductions in depression and anxiety in cancer patients. But in that particular case, the reason, one, when we finished that work a few years ago, there was very little commercial interest in this area. It's like this is all ballooned out of nowhere, and it was, so at that time that didn't exist. The couple of entities that were exploring things chose to go with major depressive disorder, which in a way is a subset of some of our people qualified for that. We actually used there is no DSM or ICD category for cancer-related distress. I predict in the future the science actually supports a nominal disorder such as that, but nonetheless it's not a recognized disorder now. So we allowed people with a large preset number of potential psychiatric disorders, with the attribution that it was because of their cancer, that all involved anxiety and or depressive symptoms, to be in that study. So only a subset were major depressive disorder patients. But entities, essentially, you can view, this is a subset of the larger, depression. And frankly, folks, whether the interest is in helping people or the interest is in money or both, would you rather treat, potentially 10% of the population, or, something like that, in terms of people with major depressive disorder, or would you rather treat, I don't know what it is, but a relatively speaking, extremely small, portion of the population with cancer-related, psychiatric distress. So, the evidence keeps moving along that for depression, things are looking really, depression itself outside of cancer is looking really promising as well. So maybe that's a good bet. And the idea is that, hey, maybe if this is approved for depression, a good number of those cancer patients who would qualify for this type of treatment. So I think it was that in the case of cancer, but there's actually, I think now interest in, we'll see what happens, but as of pretty recently, interest in really all of the therapeutic indications that we've explored or published or are, currently working on.
Maybe if Matt, if you don't mind me asking you a follow-up question. So effectively, I mean, there's a commercial decision being made by the industry, and if we're sitting here saying, which clearly you are, that if end-stage anxiety is a subset of MDD, and USONA are seeking MDD approval, an FDA pathway to that, then I guess ultimately you would get some conclusion or some access for that patient population, right? Is that fair?
Yes, potentially. So, like that would be a part of the larger population that would qualify. But again, how about the people that are showing anxiety symptoms but not depressive symptoms and don't qualify for major depressive disorder? And again, I think there's a science to support it, but there is an unrecognized syndrome that isn't quite the same thing as major depressive disorder, isn't quite the same, certainly not generalized anxiety disorder. You could argue it's an adjustment disorder, but even that's sort of a square peg and round hole. So hopefully a good number, I don't know exactly how many, but hopefully a good number of those people. But then I do think it was more of a gamble. I mean, at the time, we didn't have as much evidence as we do now for major depressive disorder. And my bet is still long-term that in terms of effect size and robustness, that as good as the depression stuff is, I'm guessing the cancer treatment stuff is just still the best bet. I mean, from having worked with patients of all these types, it's just like nothing works for everyone, but relatively speaking, gosh, it's a gimme. I mean, a good psilocybin session so directly addresses the psychological symptoms that people go through at the end of life. And for some patients with major depressive disorder, it just seems there's this constitutional issue you're dealing with that where even with a great session, it those old patterns kind of can bounce back. And again, I think we're seeing some great promise there, but I still think cancer is kind of, if you had to name one disorder that is kind of just custom fit for psilocybin treatment, cancer is probably at the top of the list.
And I would just add to that I mean, Psychedelic, which is the website and the app we're building, and I guess the digital solution that we're trying to bring to market, we want to capture all that data. We want to understand what's going on and guide and help those end stage anxieties and fears. I think we can do it. And I think once we build up that data set, I think we can go to authorities and point it out to them. And there's an awful lot of people in America who've taken a psychedelic. I mean, 2019, I think it was 6.2 million people. A lot of those people clearly are doing it for self-development, wellness efforts, and I suspect there's a ton of people in there who are doing it for that end stage anxiety. And by the way, Matthew, I spent a lot of time looking at those studies, and they're really impressive. So well done.
And along the line, thank you. And along the lines of what you're saying, I've led a number of projects more in the addictions area, kind of based on the smoking cessation work I've done, where I first started probing. I kept getting these stories when I present the data. Sometimes people would come up quietly and say, after a talk, and they'd say, hey, that happened to me. And sometimes they'd say it happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so I said, let's do a survey of that and see, just to kind of get it out there. And so found, thousands of people that said, yeah, they quit smoking because they were usually looking just to party on a psychedelic, LSD or psilocybin. And so then we launched surveys for alcohol, for cocaine, methamphetamine, cannabis. We've published opioids. We've published, results from all of it. Doesn't prove it works necessarily, but it's really compelling, data. And I'm not an expert in terms of how data, like what you're working on, how that interfaces with the, evolving regulatory, what will be acceptable. But I have to say it's extremely complementary, and it is one signal. It seems like something's going on out there, even under suboptimal conditions in most cases.
Well, Matthew, it's all supporting data, so thank you. It's very important, because you can't really put a regulatory dossier in to get a license unless you got the backup, unless you understand how it works in a wide group of patients. So that work you've done is really very valuable to everybody. So thank you. And I think you're right about oncology, particularly because if we're looking at anxiety, which we're doing at the moment, it's about 1.2 million patients in the UK alone. That's a huge number of patients. And as we were saying before, to put a study together with that number of patients, or even thinking you've got a population you can treat with that, would be nigh impossible. So you're absolutely right about the cancer bit.
Thank you. The three of you have actually generated a huge amount of audience questions, and I'm going to fire through them as quickly as possible. I'll start with you, Andrew. Where research is being done, I'm paraphrasing this question slightly, we've seen a lot of research on what you might call the classic psychedelic compounds, the 6 or 8 compounds that everybody talks about. Is there anything inherent in the clinical trial or the real-world evidence process that makes it easier to work with known compounds rather than something rarer or a new synthetic? Is the reason that we're seeing a lot of work something to do with regulations, or is it just we're starting with the stuff that's known best?
I think there's an element of you start at the start, right? But what I would say to you is we're looking to capture data. Our objective is to be psychedelic agnostic. So if you want to put in your 5-MeO DMT data in there, specify what it is, we'd love to hear about it. Tell us how it works. Tell us why it should work. Again, that data is incredibly valuable. So, but yeah, I think I think it's really as simple as that. I mean, it's just again a sort of a sensible, coherent approach, right?
Some people have said that regulators will favour compounds with simply more of a history, more data, more known kind of touch points than something completely new to them. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think any regulator cares about the safety, and that's why a clinical trial process to go from that 0 to hero status, you start with safety. That's what phase 1 is all about, and so you need to have that data set to assure safety before you go any further. So that does make sense.
Thank you. Malcolm, very quick one for you. What is the difference between global approaches to real-world evidence? So are certain countries more favourably predisposed towards it? Is it a global approach? How does that break down?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that at the moment, I'm not pushing the UK because I'm sitting in London at the moment, is actually the most open to it. Only because we've had more experience of it. But also, it does depend on what the regulator's point of view is. Some of the regulators, like the EMEA, are still struggling a little bit with real-world evidence. They haven't had as much experience. So unless you've got experience as a regulator, because I used to be a licensing assessor myself in a regulatory agency, it's very difficult. In terms of America, the FDA are very open to this. There's now crossovers between the MHRA, the EMEA, and the FDA, and indeed the Australian authorities are too. We're seeing a lot of evidence also in South America. They're very open to this sort of study. So it's varying, but what I would say is that it's getting a lot better. People are really looking at this and thinking, actually, I don't want to be left behind as a regulator. I want to be up at the top table. And I think even with Brexit and the UK, the Europeans are looking at UK and thinking, don't know, I don't want to get them to get away with this. So they're coming down that line too. So I'm hopeful. But I would say the UK is probably the most open at the moment, together with the FDA.
So I hate to break it to you guys, but we are running up against time. We're running late on our next panel. I'm sure this panel could go on for hours. There's a lot of fascinating coverage and information, and we genuinely appreciate you guys coming on to discuss.
Patrick, thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.